Hi, this is Clint Lanier. I am a professor of professional communication at New Mexico State University, and today we're going to talk about conducting research and using and citing sources. Right? This is an extremely part of a professional writer's life, or any professional really. And once you get out of college, once you get into industry, people are going to expect you to conduct research and to cite and use sources and to reference information. Okay, and obviously it's a very important skill that you have to learn while you're writing in college. It's something that you're going to have to do in my class, English 218. I expect all of the assignments to have cited sources. Okay, so let's talk about how to do that correctly. So where do you start? As far as the research is concerned, for serious research, you use a sort of hierarchy of secondary research. In other words, you're not going out and doing your own research. You're using somebody else's research. That's why we call it secondary. And this is the hierarchy of how important they are, or how accurate they are, or how trusted they are. You have journal articles at the very top, followed by conference proceedings, followed by books, and then trade magazines, and then finally popular magazines, newspapers, etc. Okay, so that's kind of the order you want to go in. Excuse me. So journal articles. Well, as I said, journal articles are the most credible sources. And that's really because most all of them are peer-reviewed. What that means is that when somebody conducts research and they send their article about that research into a journal, that article is then sent to 3, sometimes more, other people in that field, and then they read it, and they agree with it or they disagree with it, and they return it. And if they agreed with it and they said publish, then it's published. If not, then it goes back to the researcher as uncredible. So we know that it is at least trustworthy enough for other people in that industry. So an engineer, for example, writes an article about engineering, some type of research in engineering, and other engineers would then read that article and say, yeah, this research is good, it's accurate, or whatever, the numbers are accurate, and so let's go ahead and let it in. Or they'll say, no, this is false, this is junk science or something like that, or the numbers aren't correct, and then it'll be either corrected or it'll just be dismissed completely. So journal articles are the most credible sources you can use. And I say they're somewhat timely as well. So you'll have a topic that might have come up just within the past year, and it's an important topic to, say, your industry. But it is somewhat timely. For example, I'll be publishing an article next, I believe it's January. Well, I worked on that article for about a year and a half, and it's barely going to be published then. So a year and a half from the time I started the research, it's going to be published. It's not too bad, but it's not as timely as it could be. The second is conference proceedings. Conference proceedings oftentimes are, again, peer-reviewed, just like journal articles, before they'll get into a conference. So they can be very accurate and very trustworthy. A couple of problems with conference proceedings, however, is they're typically very, very brief. They don't contain all of the information that a journal article usually contains, which is the background, the problem, and so forth. Conference will basically just give a brief introduction, provide the methodology, provide the results, and it might not even have a full conclusion or discussion. It could be ongoing research, so the research isn't even finished. A lot of researchers kind of race to get their conference proceedings out there before the research is completely done, because they want to be the first one that gets their name attached to whatever it is. So but it's very timely. In other words, conference proceedings are usually written within a very brief span of that research being done. They're not seen as credible as journal articles. So if you have to go for the two, you definitely want to look for journal articles versus conference proceedings. Next, we move on to books. Now, one of the bad parts about books is they're just not timely at all. I've published a couple of books, and it took a couple of years to get each of them from finished to published. So oftentimes, by the time a book comes out about something, that something, whether it's an event or research or whatever, is a couple of years in the past. So oftentimes it's not very timely. However, they're known for being very in-depth. So if you want to find foundational information about something, background information about something, a book obviously is going to be a great source of research, a great source of information, and something that you want to cite. Next, we move on to trade magazines. So these are magazines that exist in a specific field, but they're not considered journal articles. They're almost like newspapers or magazines that just report about stuff within a field. So, for example, engineering, mechanical engineering, there will be a type of magazine that's for mechanical engineers, but it doesn't give full-fledged journal articles. It only gives kind of brief treatment of them. Okay, so it's good for industry-specific information, and it's good for affecting practice. In other words, you take research. Oftentimes, these trade magazines will write an article about research that's been done, and then show how it's applied within industry. So it's really good for that type of information. Following that, you have popular magazines. Again, not very credible at all now, but they do give us an idea of current news, state of affairs, and so forth. They're oftentimes not very in-depth, as I said, not very credible or serious. And as we're seeing today, they can often be skewed or biased in a political fashion, one way or the other. So you have to be kind of careful with using those in your research. Now, what about the internet? Obviously, the internet has become more credible. Now, when I talk about the internet, I'm not talking about online journals. Online journals have become very popular, obviously, because they're cheap, right, to publish. But online journals and online magazines typically have the same type of credibility as hard copy magazines, hard copy journals. Okay, so that's not what I'm really talking about. And further, those have to be cited as if they're real journals, but you do give the web address for them. I'm talking about just generally websites. What do we do about websites? The first thing that a lot of people like to do, a lot of my students will do, I guarantee it, when they're assigned something to write, they go to Wikipedia for the subject, and they start looking at Wikipedia. Well, is Wikipedia trustworthy? Yes or no. Problem is, you have to be careful. The internet sites generally are good to learn about basic foundational information. They're good for trivial matters, but again, they're not as credible, they're not as respected, and they're not trusted. Let me give you an example. I just reviewed a paper for a journal, and the subject of the journal of that issue was going to be about usability, something that in professional writing we have to, and in product design, something that we worry about. So I reviewed this paper, and my complaint was that the author only cited one source of information about usability, and further, that source was a website. It was somebody's blog, basically. And there are hundreds of journal articles out there that he or she could have cited with regards to usability, but the credibility of the whole article for me just kind of goes down the drain. And so I kind of said that obviously you need to go out and find some more sources. So not credible enough, not as respected, and oftentimes not trusted. Now there are different ways you can tell. There you see .org, .com, .gov, and .net. Of those, which do you think is most trustworthy? Probably the .gov, right? Now, if you find a website that's a .gov website, say you're doing environmental research and you go to the EPA.gov, that would be totally fine because typically they house real science, real research. Likewise, if you go to Los Alamos Labs or Sandia Labs, you're looking at an article from there, it's going to be real stuff. But do me a favor, go out and look at that dhmo.org and tell me if that site is credible. I hope you get a laugh if you go out and look at it, but the site's not credible. It looks credible, it sounds like it's credible, but it's just a ridiculous parody site, okay? So be really careful about information that you get from the internet, be careful about the websites that you search for information on, and try to use more journal articles, trade publications, conference proceedings, and books than you do just internet websites, okay? Now, as far as citing sources is concerned, you absolutely have to cite your sources, and I can't repeat this enough. You must cite your sources. Use of internet research is making cut and paste a lot easier, which is a real problem. If you're caught plagiarizing in a class, you could obviously fail that assignment. You could fail the whole course. You could be I mean, the punishment could be pretty severe. So to use information that you find, you just own it, okay? Don't just repeat it. In other words, read an article and integrate what you just learned from that article into what you're writing about. It also means using more than one source, okay? Take 3 different sources, read all of their articles, and then put all that information together, and then in your own words, you write whatever it is you're going to write. Now, as I said in school, not citing research, using somebody else's words without quoting or citing, it is plagiarism. As I said, it can get you expelled, you can flunk or whatever. So it's really bad. But it's also bad outside of schools. Professionals, some professionals do it. Let me give you a couple of examples. Well, this one is the BlackBerry case. I don't know how many of you might remember Blackberries came along in late 90s and 2000s, and they were kind of before we had Wi-Fi everywhere, before we had digital streaming services everywhere. It was one of the only devices, handheld devices, that it served as a phone, but you could also get your email on it, which is kind of a big deal. And the way it worked is that if you sent somebody an email, it would go to their server, and then BlackBerry would basically hold it, and then the BlackBerry service would hold it for you until you got into service, and then BlackBerry would download it to your phone, and you could read your email. So it was kind of a big deal. But let's talk about what happened with BlackBerry. There's a company called NTP that in 1990 created a system to send emails between computers and wireless devices. Now, this is a small Canadian company. Now, in the late 1990s, Research in Motion, RIM, which designed the BlackBerry, released their product, and it was hugely successful. Government employees used it. I remember Barack Obama had one. So it was a very, very important and successful device. But then in 2000, NTP noticed that there are a lot of similarities between BlackBerry's technologies and its own technology. And they sued in 2000. And as it turned out, in 2001, the jury found for NTP. Apparently, Research in Motion ripped off all of their code, NTP's code, and just put it into their own device. So it was a fairly blatant ripoff. RIM, of course, appealed, and they took the case to the Supreme Court, who finally ruled against Research in Motion in 2005, and it cost them $612 million. And it just came down to cut and pasting and not giving attribution. In this case, they would have had to have paid NTP, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to try to skirt around it, but they got caught. And the result, Research in Motion isn't even out there anymore. Blackberries aren't a thing anymore. And this is one of the things that really took the company down. So, yeah, while not citing sources is bad in college, it's even worse in industry once you're outside of college. So just don't do that. Here are another couple of cases you can look at. LG sued Apple for the design of their phone. You can see on the left there is the LG Prada phone. They came out with that first, and then Apple came out with their iPhone later. They sued and they won. Next was, and you can't really see that, my apologies, but the World Tower in New York City, the design that won the competition was called the Freedom Tower, and that was just like a tower called the Olympic Tower that was designed for a different competition. And the way that worked was the guy's name was Thomas Shine. He entered his design called the Olympic Tower into this architectural kind of contest. David Child, who designed the Freedom Tower to go to New York City at the World Trade Center, he was one of the judges on the competition that selected the Olympic Tower. And then he went back and he created the Freedom Tower, which basically has this twist to it, exactly like the Olympic Tower. And so he got sued. So they're just things that you really have to be careful of. Plagiarizing is always bad. Again, outside of school, it can really, really hurt you. So bottom line, always cite where you get your information. Never cut and paste without quoting. Never try to pass off somebody else's effort as your own. Remember that citing sources builds credibility. It allows readers to find more information. It's not just about how much you know. And I get students all the time that say, you know what, Dr. Lanier, I've been doing this all my life, so I know everything there is to know about it. That's great. But first of all, prove that. Okay, you don't have a PhD behind your name or anything like that. And unfortunately, if I Google your name, it doesn't come up with whatever that particular topic is. Also, it's not just about how much you know, about getting information. It's about credibility. Okay, how credible do you want your paper, your information, or your advice to be? Because it's not going to be as credible just coming from one person. We all have to cite information. It shows that we went out and we conducted research. Now we went beyond what we just know and we looked at it elsewhere. And also, it helps the audience to find more information about the subject if they're looking for it. So, how do we cite? Now that's something that students of mine always struggle with. So I'm going to go ahead and teach you this, how to do it now. Here we have a paragraph, and then below that we have the reference for that paragraph. Now, that paragraph, the information in that paragraph, came directly from that source, The History of New Mexico by John Lawson. So how would we cite it? Okay, some of it's summarized, some of it could be quoted. So let's look at the different ways that we can cite it. One way is simply putting the last name of the author followed by the year of the year of publication, 1995, Lawson, 1995. We put that at the end of the article, and what that tells the reader is that everything in that paragraph, that information in that paragraph, came from that one source, Lawson, 1995. It didn't come from other sources. Now, it could be anywhere in there. It could be a combination. Typically, this is done when we've summarized a bunch of information that this person, Lawson, had written, and we put it into this entire paragraph. Okay. Another way is if we want to cite just a specific sentence. So in this case, we could be citing that the President of Mexico, so on and so forth, was facing desperate times at home, according to Lawson, 1995. Now notice, it's Lawson, 1995. It's at the end of this sentence after that information. So in this case, we're telling the reader that just that sentence came from Lawson, 1995. The sentence below it might have come somewhere else, or it could have come from nowhere. Okay. A couple of things I want you to notice here is the period at the end of that sentence comes after the end of the parentheses. A lot of students make the mistake of ending the sentence, putting the period, and then putting the citation. That's not how it works. It's the other way around. You put the citation before that period. Okay. Let's look at a different method. Let's say you're quoting him, quoting this author specifically. In that case, you would put quotes around the part that come from this author. So the was, there's a quote before was, and then after funds. So in other words, somewhere in this book is the line, was also facing desperate times at home as government was hurrying for funds. Where is that line found? It's found in Lawson, 1995, page 83. Okay, so it's a very specific page number. So that's what you've got to do if you give a direct quote. You have to give the page number. The others, the previous versions, say this one and this one, would essentially be suggesting that I've summarized information that came from that particular source. Whereas in this case, that's exactly what Lawson said. Okay. You could also state, according to Lawson, and then put in parentheses the year of publication, and then comma, and then the rest of the information. Now, if we put it this way, you don't see any other citations. This is enough of a citation for all of that information. It comes at the beginning. I've introduced the author, Lawson, and the year of publication, and then I've said all this stuff is according to Lawson. Okay, so my citation is just fine right there. So how do you cite? You cite the source of an idea after the idea has been written. Okay, and when I grade papers, I look and I say, well, where did you get this information? And I do that about every sentence because it has to come from somewhere. Okay, if using a direct quote, you include the last name, the year, and the page number. And if you're summarizing, you include the last name and the year. Every idea, every argument, every assertion you make, every piece of information should be cited because it increases the credibility and the quality of your writing and your work. And people will trust you and trust what you're writing. In my classes, for my students who I hope are watching this, you're required to cite your information. So I'm going to look at every little piece of information, say, where did you get that? It should be cited. This also includes images. Okay, if you get an image from somewhere, you need to cite where you got that from. So it should say, for example, figure 1, a boat. And then from, and usually the the URL of wherever you got it from. Okay, so make sure you also cite the images as well. As far as reference lists are concerned, all sources that are in the text, including the images, must be included in a works cited or references list. Okay, everything. The reference list should include all sources used. Right. Sources, for my students, sources must be properly structured via APA or MLA, one of the two. I don't care which one you use, but it has to be one of those. Okay, you can refer to your book's appendix for those that are, again, taking my class, the Johnson-Sheehan text. Go to the appendix in the back, and you'll find all the examples that you'll need in order to correctly or properly create your APA or MLA reference list.